Welcome, everyone. I'm Noelle Dubiansky. I'm a partner in Goodwin's Life Sciences Transactions Group, where I focus on commercial agreements and advising our life sciences companies on a range of complex IP and strategic collaborations and licensing. Today's webinar, we're going to be focused on strategic options in a downturn for private companies. Just a few housekeeping items before we begin. This presentation is being recorded. This is a general presentation about rapidly changing issues. It should not be construed as legal advice because we are not considering the facts of your specific situation. If you have a particular situation on which you want or need advice, please reach out to a member of your Goodwin team, or you can feel free to reach out to Josh or myself, and we can connect you with the appropriate Goodwin person addressing those issues. All attendees will be muted, and if you'd like to ask a question, feel free to put the question in the chat. We'll reserve some time at the end of the webinar to answer those questions. And again, always you can feel free to reach out to myself or Josh. We'll have our contact information at the end. We'll aim to answer all of your questions at the end, but again, please feel free to continue to ask them throughout the webinar. I'm going to hand it over now to Josh to introduce himself.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Josh Rotner. I'm a partner here in our life sciences group. I represent venture-backed biotech companies throughout their life cycle from formation through M&A exit. And I'm pleased to introduce our guest, Jay Parrish. Jay is a chairman and chief executive officer of Pretzel Therapeutics. He's also a venture partner at Arch Venture Partners and co-founder of Rome Therapeutics. Jay most recently co-founded and served as chief business officer of Vir Biotechnology, where he helped lead the company as its first employee through its IPO and first drug approval. Jay is an accomplished scientist who began his career at Gilead Sciences in the medicinal chemistry group, where his research focused on discovery of small molecule antivirals. He was a co-inventor of ledapaspir and remdesivir. Sorry, Jay. And after nearly a decade in research, he joined Gilead's corporate development team, ultimately leading infectious disease business development for the company. Jay has authored over 25 peer-reviewed scientific publications and holds over 30 issued patents and applications. Jay, thanks so much for joining us. I know that your insights on this topic are going to be extremely valuable for all of us.
I wish they would have let us co-invest on that product.
Great. So Jay, when capital was abundant, it seemed that companies were doing a Series A financing, a Series B financing, and then going straight to IPO. Now that capital is more limited, what strategies have you seen companies adopt to successfully navigate this environment? And what do investors want to see now that they didn't in 2021?
Yeah, I mean, I think we got off the rails a little bit as an industry. You know, it seemed to me for a while that companies were being formed just to go public, right? I mean, at the end of the day, you'll hear me say this probably multiple times during this discussion, but like we're here to serve patients. And I think at the end of the day, I think it was George Merck, and I'm paraphrasing, said something like, you know, if you focus on patients, if you focus on getting drugs to patients, everything else will follow, right? So, you know, I think that's where we need to be as an industry always, right? Because then good things will come. All our stakeholders, all of our shareholders will win. So, you know, to answer this, probably the second question first, I think investors want to see a good story and a path to value, right? And I think, you know, that's why I think earlier stage companies are getting funded, because it's this newer, hot new thing. The later stage companies with assets that are closer to, approval are getting funded because, hey, I can do a net present value and actually calculate how much revenue you're going to make. I can even do a bottoms up, forecast. It's the companies kind of in the middle that are, maybe candidate stage to a healthy human volunteer trial that are struggling. And so, that's, I think, the state of play today. It does seem to me like the window is opening a little bit, but that's just from my seat. As far as strategies are concerned, I mean, I think the easiest thing to do is to be a focused company, with a good story and a clear path of how to create, again, value to patients, which again will then lead to value to shareholders.
Yeah, that's great. It's interesting you talk about that, right? Because in looking at the VC dollars invested, 2024 was actually very similar in terms of total amount invested to 2020, right? So that was a good year when we were all going through 2020. But you're totally right in that we see the data sort of as a dumbbell effect of the investment at the very early stage companies, very late stage companies.
And Josh, and I think also the thing that happened there was you had a few companies a few very early startup companies get big lion's share of those dollars, right? I don't know what the percentages are, but a lot of the AI focused companies, the machine learning focused companies were getting inordinate amount of money.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Um, yeah, so it's definitely the companies in the middle this time having a hard time raising. And I think, that's probably a lot for us to focus on today, right? Like
Yeah, yeah,
how
yeah,
do they
yeah.
make sure they have that story to
Sure.
continue around?
Josh, is there such a thing as a good down round then? And what would that look like structurally or strategically?
Yeah, look, I think given the way the markets come out, we'd always prefer it to be a flat round or an up round, right? But right now, it's better for the company to stay alive so long as the science is good than not, right? And that requires getting funded. So, particularly if the company last raised at the height of the market, right, it might need to reassess what its valuation is, and a down round might be necessary. The good news is people know now that the valuations have been changing and decreasing for macroeconomic factors, not necessarily specific to the company. So it's not necessarily a negative marker on a company's ability to fundraise to do a down round in the same way that it would have been 2 or 3 years ago. And it can be helpful to sort of reset expectations, right? So it can really, I'm not saying that that should be the outcome, but I am saying that maybe companies should not be as scared of it as they might have been a few years ago. Um, Generally speaking, we need to make sure that both the valuation and the lick pref stack are sort of set up right to attract new capital. And so, like, what does that mean? That means that from a valuation perspective, the investors in the next round like need to be able to see a path to an attractive exit for themselves and a multiple that's going to be good for them and their fund. Um, they also need to make sure that the lick pref stack makes context in the overall valuation, makes sense in the context of the overall valuation, right? So if your lick pref sort of takes up the whole post money valuation, that can then cause problems about the allocation of proceeds in any IPO or exit. So, yes, down rounds can be useful or necessary, and it's not the end of the world, but you sort of have to think about how to structure those. Um,
Yeah,
one
and
thing that
just don't forget that at the end of the day, they're artificial valuations, right? And the real value creation for shareholders and patients is when you have the data that you're going to generate in a clinical trial.
Yeah,
Right.
100%, 100%. And so if we have strong data, right, that often eases the pressure on these. And then sometimes the strong data, right, will be a good filter for who wants to invest and who doesn't.
Yeah.
And that's another way to sort of reassess the lick pref, right? If you come out with science that investors are excited about, then you could do things like, hey, you put in, call it a pay to play, where people who are still excited about continuing to fund the business get to keep their lick pref, and people who aren't are perhaps converted to common, which reduces the lick pref stack, but it reduces it in a way that helps the people that are continuing to support the company's funding, and you can sort of naturally reset the stack so it's aligned with the valuation there.
So Jay, on that note, since we're talking about how capital is scarce these days, how important do you think business development is? And if it's a critical factor, how should companies be managing their development pipelines in order to ensure that they're appropriately balancing long-term goals with kind of short-term capital needs?
Yeah, I mean, business development obviously can fill a funding gap. I do not like the word non-dilutive funding, by the way, because at the end of the day, in my opinion, this is one man's opinion, that business development is probably the most dilutive thing that you do because you're giving away the management team's time and you're giving away the company's intellectual property. And we're intellectual property built companies, right? So I tend not to use that word, but let's just we'll call a truce on that one. But I think companies that are getting business development deal done today are living to fight another day, right? I mean, some of these platform companies that are doing deals, they're 25, $50 million up front. I've seen, recently in some of the companies that we're in. And that's a year or two of funding in some cases, right? Now you are spending some of that money to service the deal. but you're not necessarily spending the venture dollars that you have on the balance sheet. As far as the setup is concerned, again, I don't think my strong opinion, and this may not be shared, but my strong opinion is you shouldn't set up a company to do business development because the cost of capital is too high. Like if I'm gonna be a service group for Pfizer or Merck, let's go set something up where it's largely offshored. It's a different cap table. It's a different model. But again, if you are building cool stuff that's going to help and aid patients, that's what pharma cares about, then the business development will tend to come. I do think, I think it's a question you're going to ask me now, but maybe I'll just say like the I think you should start doing business development on day one, right?
Mhm.
Be out there forming those relationships, getting the science out, talking about what you're doing, getting people excited because it's a long process to be able to transact, number one. And number two, business development can help you get over this hurdle, right? So a deal earlier in the company's lifespan can be fruitful because number one, it can bring in money, but can also bring in that sense of validation that some people like.
Yeah, I mean, and on that note, I'll say, because I think we're going to get to this a little bit later about kind of timing. And in my view, I agree. Like, I don't think that you can ever start at the BD side early.
Yeah.
These days, I'm seeing deals take 12 to 18 months. Folks are talking to people at JP Morgan, 2 JP Morgans ago, and they're still talking, and we're just getting deals executed right now. So I do think that you need to plan early and ahead. And when you're looking at your cash runway, really kind of see like, what am I going to need in the next 12 to 18 months and really step it up at that point because it's going to take a while to get from even to a term sheet, even, to a definitive agreement. And so I think, again, to your point, Jay, I don't think you can ever kind of be too early on
Yeah,
that
never.
side.
Yeah, yeah, and cultivate multiple options with multiple pharmas, and don't forget about the medium-sized pharmas. I mean, a lot of people will only focus on the U.S. and Europe, big guys, the Big Ten, but there's 25, 40 companies on the list that can transact, and then there's this new class of companies that's come up. I think they've always been there, but I think there's more of them today. Companies that have recently commercialized, and all of a sudden they're looking for pipeline assets. They may not have the big bank accounts, but they can certainly transact. They can certainly help you, much like, any other deal that you would do, especially for early stage deals where like the absolute number up front can be a little smaller.
Yeah, I mean, I think I see a lot of clients using different specialty pharmas, especially
Yeah,
in the EU, for those types of
sure.
split territory deals to kind of supplement, their cash runway by doing a split territory deal where they might get an upfront. It will help. They'll retain value still in the US, but it not only validates the program, but it also kind of helps in lots of different ways.
Sure.
Noel, what other structures are you seeing earlier stage companies use for partnering and business development opportunities?
Sure. I mean, I kind of view, I think that people should view partnering not just as kind of capital raising. They really kind of are risk sharing arrangements. So a lot of the deals that I'm seeing our early stage companies go into are more on the cost sharing, in the development cost sharing and being able to share that risk. Also getting to a point of inflection where pharma then is, thinks the asset is more de-risked and they're willing to kind of in a lot of cases, they are option deals, so opt in at that point. So we see a lot of at the early stage deals, I would say option to license deals. We've been
Mhm.
seeing a fair bit of build to buy, so an option to acquire. Is also, I think, a deal structure that we've seen a lot of VCs kind of want to do over the last, I would say, few years. We're continuing to see a lot of different target-based deals for our platform companies again, trying to maximize the value of those platforms. I think all of the deals that we're seeing will have some form of a milestone royalty. Sometimes we will see our clients wanting to, again, retain value in the sense of having some form of an option to co-commercialize or co-promote later. So giving yourself flexibility, I think is key while also trying to, essentially pave that kind of runway that you're trying to cover.
Nice. Um, Jay, as companies are thinking about sort of prioritizing their assets when they're thinking about partnering or even just managing their budgets, um, how do you think companies should think about that? They got to manage their budget. They might have some assets they want to partner. How do you think about them paring, or how should they think about paring down or prioritizing their programs?
I mean, I don't think there's a one size fits all solution, obviously. I mean, I think it is probably based on, it's like a horse race. And sometimes in the beginning, you'll start with three or four assets, and there will definitely be a spread over the quarter mile that's run or whatever it is. The later stage assets tend to bring more value, right? And that's not just value from a pharma perspective or partnering perspective, but also when you go into fundraising. There are obviously funds out there that will only look at you if you're a platform company. There are funds out there that are agnostic to that. I think having a stable of assets, is always a good thing. That was always the Bob Nelson approach to biotech, ABC. We'll fund ABC, and A will either partner or die, but then we'll still have B and C, and we'll live to fight another day. I think it's a good way to do things. In an austere environment, I would say the way we did it at Pretzel was we started out, we kind of resourced, we had three different platforms. It kind of seems ridiculous now, but we had three different platforms and I think eight different programs, and we resourced them fairly equally in the first 12 to 18 months, when it was less spend in those days and capital was more available. But then, very quickly after that first 12 months, we started to say, hey, like, we need to slow down this project. Hey, let's like put that platform on the shelf. And now Pretzel has, really four pipeline products, two of which get 90% of the budget, one of which gets about 75% of the budget. So of that budget. So that's how it just kind of goes over time, organically. And I think the thing you don't want to do is choke off early stage science, too early, because you never know where it's going to end up.
Yeah. As you're thinking about that, Jade, how do you think about sort of balancing keeping the key scientific talent that's needed to bring these programs forward, and also scientific momentum for your lead assets, versus prioritizing the programs? How does that fit into the calculus?
I mean, I think, communication is the biggest thing you can do in any environment in life, right? I mean, that's family, home, work. So communicating, over communicating sometimes, with, hey, this is where we're at, team. And I'm not just talking about like this, your reports and the C-level. I'm talking about like the entire company,
Mhm.
letting people hear and see and be part of that. Like, hey, this is what the plan is. Here we go. I think keeps people informed. The other thing is, I think giving them opportunities, and allowing them to be, to have, not necessarily a say in everything, but like, to feel like they're part of that decision-making process is key. And that's, it's been an important part of the companies I've been in to retain talent. Um, and then the other thing is like, you know, having, having the ability to say, hey, like, we're not going to continue this, like, and we're supportive of you looking somewhere else. We'd love to keep you, but hey, like this isn't going to work out. We'll move you over here, or we'll help you find a role. That tends to unlock people to be a little bit more free, because then they feel like, well, I'm not trapped here and I got to get this to work. And then I know that, this team's going to take care of me and help me find a role if it doesn't. In my opinion, that's kept people on the books a little longer than they have in the past, where it's more of the traditional, like, we'll tell you when you're done, and you don't know anything until the day before, and then you get a letter in your, a note in your inbox that you're out. And I think that's not the way we run companies anymore,
Mhm.
especially with this newer generation.
Yeah. Yeah. Jay, I'm going to throw a curveball because we didn't talk about this beforehand, but as we're thinking about partnering opportunities, does the team and the synergies of these partnering deals come into play as you're thinking about how to structure these? Like if you have certain groups of people who are focused on one program, how that gets taken care of as part of your deal?
So let me just play that back. So you're asking me, is like cultural fit something we think about when we do
Yeah.
business development deals?
Or maybe not just cultural fit, but opportunities for your teams to now take their talents to, the partners programs.
So I'll answer the first question first. I mean, if you have that luxury, absolutely. And I've been in a couple of deals. The one was an M&A I can think of, right now that we were choosing between two cultures. We had, very similar terms, and we ended up going with, the fast, flashy American company versus the stodgy, the bigger pharma. And that we benefited from that, right? Because we were that fast company, and we matched them culturally. We knew more of the people inside. We felt like we'd be a better fit. You don't always have that luxury. Sometimes you only have one deal, right? And you're lucky to get that one, and get it over the finish line is hell over high water. But yeah, so we do consider that. And as far as like bringing teams in on BD, so they're sort of twofold. It's the lead up to the deal, and then there's the alliance management piece. So the lead up to the deal, that's a great way to retain talent because everybody thinks BD is so fun and flashy. So a great way is to get people involved, even down, at the junior levels, right? Like, hey, you're going to help us, we're going to help us put this together. You're going to help us pitch this. You can help us do diligence, whatever it may be. Here's the terms. Here's how we're thinking about this. They love that, right? People eat that up. And then after the deal is signed, from the alliance management perspective, yeah, there will be some amount of the team that will service that deal. Maybe it's the full research team in some cases. Maybe it's just a subgroup. There's usually, as you guys know better than I do, there's usually many committees that get formed, and putting people on those committees can also be another great way to retain talent.
Yeah, great. Great.
I'll add to that too, that I do find in my kind of negotiations of partnerships and collaborations, like a partnership and a collaboration really is a marriage, right? Like you're going to be in it, for the long haul.
Yeah.
And so what I do tend to see is that during the negotiations, when the parties are more collaborative, that's what we see after the deal is signed too. And when I tend to have negotiations that are a little bit more contentious and just definitely not parties become, more aligned or trying to collaborate. It's more of kind of like a farm, I'll say it like a farmer really trying to be more aggressive and win points. And there's not maybe necessarily somebody on that side that is the champion and really trying to advocate and make this a more collaborative part of the process. That's where I see, even after the deal is signed, that there's a lot of, potential, you know, disagreements or misalignments or potential disputes that arise. So I do think like choosing your partner to the extent as Jay said, to the extent you have that luxury, think about that when you are choosing that partner, because I do tend to see that that is really kind of where the relationship continues to grow.
Yeah. So to that end, a lot of companies at this stage are, having short runway and trying to find partnering deals as a way to extend that runway. Noel, how are companies maintaining negotiating leverage when the cash runway is short?
Yeah, so I think we talked about, definitely starting early, but like maintaining that leverage, to the extent that you have that luxury and you can create some type of a competitive tension. So I don't think you should ever foreclose that, even if you're in term sheet, even if you're in agreement negotiations, you should still be continuing to keep up with discussions with other parties because, until that definitive agreement is signed, the deal is not done. And especially in today's environment, like I've had several deals over the last few months, like really we were almost down to signing and it was still kind of like, well, what do the tariffs mean? Like, is that, and it put a pause onto the negotiation. So again, until that agreement is signed, the deal is not done. So don't foreclose that there are other parties involved. And, as we were saying, I'm seeing deals take a lot longer these days. So as these deals take longer, data is continuing to be generated. So then there's continued value that is being created. And again, like that changes. If you started a deal, you started talking to a partner 12, 18 months ago, that deal by the time you sign a year later might not have the same value that you initially had negotiated. So I also think that brings in, other partners, but also don't like, foreclose the possibility that, the terms you negotiated 12 months ago on that term sheet might not be the same, upfront that you think you should be getting because, there's been a new inflection point or there have been new deals that have shown, a different market kind of position. So keep that into perspective. I also think that you have to really emphasize the value. It's not just, the deal. The deal is really kind of, as Jay was saying, it's the people, it's the scientists, it's whatever the validated data is, it's your IP position. So continuing to emphasize that throughout the negotiations, I think, will help you maintain that leverage. And then I would say, don't forget that you're negotiating, not just price, it's the overall terms of the deal. So some deals might have a lower upfront, but maybe in that deal you are retaining the US rights, right? Like that might be important to the company. That's how you're retaining the value. And so like just thinking about it as an overall kind of holistic approach about what the deal is. I will say that in today's environment, though, what I'm seeing is I am seeing pharmas be more aggressive than they were a few years ago on these collaboration and licensing deals. And so just because it might not have been they might not be the same terms that you saw a few years ago, I think you have to be open to that, because I do think pharma these days, they've always had leverage, right? But I think they have even more leverage, right? And I also think that they are even more risk adverse than they have been in the past because of so many companies experiencing wind downs and insolvency. And so we're seeing a lot of terms in our collaboration and license agreements that lend that to wanting to protect them more. And so we will see, potentially pharmas wanting step in research rights, tech transfer where normally they might not have had before, or even a reduction in milestones if certain things, don't go the way they think they should. So be open to not necessarily, getting the terms that you might have gotten a few years ago.
And if your syndicate is open, always ask for equity. It's easy for them to do, oftentimes. Some pharmas.
Jay, speaking of the syndicate, do you have any tips for executives when they're managing their directors and existing investors' expectations during these types of periods?
I mean, same thing with employees, communication. Over communication with your board is never a bad thing. Josh, you and I always laugh about this. I never ask questions to the board. I always want to go to them. Here's what we're doing, and this is why, and you like it, right? Like that's kind of how I approach it. But I think communicating with your board about what you're doing, when you're going to do it, and how you're going to do it is important. I think having them understand the constraints that you're under in terms of timing or funding is important, and having those conversations on a biweekly or monthly basis, so they're informed and they don't show up to the board meeting like, oh my God. And then, keeping them informed on, where the stage of the programs are, I think is always an important thing. I think, board members I think Noel will laugh at this, like board members tend to think of, it's kind of like when you drive and you honk at a car, it's like depersonalized, board members kind of look at BD in this very depersonalized way, and they think it's easy and fast, and they're going to bring a lot of money. And even experienced board members sometimes think that, and it's so keeping them abreast of any business development activity that's going on in a timing perspective, I think is always a good thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Sorry, Josh, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just going to say, I definitely see that. And I kind of think bringing them in early is kind of what I see is also kind of the way to make sure that they don't want to say yes to a deal that has low value for you, right? Like getting them aligned early on. So then when you're in this position and maybe potentially being cash strapped, they kind of know already what the story is. And so then you're not necessarily forced to take a deal that really isn't going to be the best one.
Yeah.
And then I think the other thing on the flip side, a lot of times what I've seen, Josh, on boards, and you'll appreciate this one as well. I mean, I think a board member thinks that, hey, this company, this asset's worth, it's in the metabolic space, in the obesity space, and therefore I should get $100 million up front. Well, maybe but what do we need to spend to get there? What's the probability of success that we're going to get there? I mean, they tend to think that nothing's going to go wrong. And, what is the profile going to look like when we get there, right? Is it going to be the $100 million asset, or is it going to be pharma's interested only then if you have human data? So then we got to spend another, 10, 15, $20 million to get the human data. And then it's like, at that point, it's a 3 or 4 year process, and the field has shifted. And all of a sudden what you thought was interesting, in year 1 is no longer interesting to the field in year 4. So you have to be very careful. It's a temporal, the temporal aspects of this business.
Yeah, interesting. Um, Jay, are you feeling like directors and investors are putting any unique pressures on management during sort of this economic cycle that's different from prior economic cycles?
Um, I would say the pressure to go public has been lessened. I think the pressure to do business development has greatened.
Mhm.
I do think that the other pressure is being capital efficient, right? Hey, like, why do you have, 30 people when you can do this with five? I think taking, big, ugly, and there's that influence article about space, like, hey, be cautious about the space and the rent and the lease. Those are the type of things I'm seeing on the boards I'm on. So lessons IPO, like let's go out that way, but more like governance and and BD.
Yeah, back to old school
Like
management.
building a business, back to actually having to build a business. Who would have thought?
Exactly.
But we have to make products that sell revenue, that generate revenue. Yeah.
Exactly.
Josh, from your perspective, are there lessons from prior downturns that you've experienced that are helpful during this time?
Yeah, we've talked about a lot of these, including prioritizing programs, conserving cash. One interesting shift as an observer is that in the boom years, having multiple programs was really attractive to investors because it meant the
Mhm.
company had a lot of shots on goal. Now that's almost a turnoff because it means the company's going to have a big burn, and people are needing to sort of pivot and prioritize accordingly. Um, One actually thing that's a little bit better now, I think, than was at least in 2009 is that some of the alternative vehicles, like reverse mergers, for example, are a lot more common and less stigmatized, right? Right now, reverse mergers are pretty common and people are happy to do it. Can be very attractive to both the private company and the public company shareholders if you get the right synergy. And that sort of is a feature that wasn't necessarily around in 2009. And then the fact that we just had this wild like COVID to boom cycle with SPACs and all these crazy things has actually meant that a lot of people are familiar with a lot of different transaction types. And so I'm seeing that management is much easier to like get their head around sort of alternatives and pivot more quickly than we were sort of in that period between the sort of financial crisis of 2009 and the sort of COVID boom. So I actually think that we're a little bit more open to some alternative structures, which has given people more degrees of freedom during this period.
Yeah, and I'm seeing it, in the other route that I'm seeing is consolidations.
Mhm.
Um, I'm seeing companies wind down and then those cash on the balance sheet. And it's like, hey, do you want your cash back or we'll pay you, dollar for dollar, and we'll spend that money into a new co, right? And sometimes without the assets and sometimes without the people. So just a straight financial transaction. That's happened. I never saw that. You didn't see that as much a few years back. I've seen that a lot more.
Yeah, yeah. And friendly funds are combining
Friendly funds.
synergistic
Yeah,
portfolio companies. We've
that's right.
we've seen a lot of that in the past
That's
12 to
right.
18 months, which has been great. Um,
Um, Jay, do you think that the current market's a temporary correction or something more of a structural reset for biotech companies?
I think probably a little of both. I mean, I do think we got, like as I said in the beginning of the call, we got over our skis a little bit, and I think the business model really did become we're going to go public. Um, but at the end of the day, if you go back to focusing on the patients, which is where we should have always been, then the model is the same, right? So I do think, at least for the foreseeable future, you're going to have a good story. I think there's going to be less biotech. I think there's going to be less venture dollars. I think, the industry as a whole will be scaled down in partial because of the downturn, but also with some of the structural changes that are happening within the government. But I do think at the end of the day, we will come out of this, at least temporarily, healthier, and we'll all have a very, very strong respect for, this downturn, this five-year downturn, and hopefully we remember some lessons. But I did a part-time MBA when I was at Gilead, and I took a behavioral finance class, and they always said You're in a bubble when someone says it's different this time. And so when you hear in the next few years, hopefully, sooner rather than later, hey, it's different this time, it's time to sell.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. Um,
But let's say by the end of the decade, I mean, again, good, by the way, even in the depression of the 1920s, good companies still got started and funded, right? So like, good companies are still getting money. Good management teams, that know how to run companies are getting money. Later stage assets that have been de-risked are getting money. So it's not like the market is totally broken. I would argue too that it's back to where it probably always should have been. Now, like, it's a Gaussian distribution, and maybe we're only in this first standard deviation. Maybe we need to be two to really be functional, and because we do need to capture some of those wild and crazy ideas. Pretzel was a wild and crazy idea, right? That's now sort of transitioning to the next phase. That's where you make, the cutting edge, groundbreaking discoveries, and we do need to fund those as well. And hopefully we'll get back to those soon.
The one thing I think that you touched upon, Jay, that we haven't mentioned too is I will say that, I think you mentioned being ready to sell. Like I will say I see a lot of discussions starting off as partnering and collaboration discussions and then pivoting to M&A. And
Yeah.
so I do think that companies need to, always be flexible and keep that in mind and also not see that as necessarily a failure in today's market. Because I think that, depending on, where the company is, how many assets they have, or what's going on, maybe it's only an asset sale, right? Or maybe it's an M&A, a full M&A kind of exit. But in today's kind of environment, that's not necessarily a failure if you wanted to originally do a collaboration or partnership and you end up doing an M&A exit.
100%. And what I think is interesting is it's funny. I got off a call. I just got off the call with a fund that was like, well, we only invest in platform companies. And I said to them, hey, that's great, but every successful company is essentially becomes a single asset company. And if you look at pharmas, if you look at the Mercks and the Pfizers and the Gileads of the world, big biotechs, I saw the statistic recently and I've forgotten the exact numbers, but they may have 1 to 3 products to generate 60 to 90% of their revenue. So in a sense, even they are not necessarily in a classic sense single asset companies, but they're not this broad portfolio company that people think they are. Like even the biggest guys. So like, that notion of being a single asset company, is another thing that I think people get tripped up over. Like we have to be a platform company because that gives us the most optionality. That's great, but you're going to, at some point, if you continue to do well, you will be a single asset company because you're not going to have the resources to finance all of this, right? And very, very few companies do. But having said that, one of the ways to solve that conundrum, is to do BD, like we talked about.
Mhm.
But the other way to do it is to sell, right? Because then the pharma can internalize those programs. And here's a really great win-win is if you can get them to buy you for the mainline asset, right? And then spin back to you the portfolio that they didn't want to take forward and then fund some of it. I've seen that happen. We have, Rich Heyman, very famous example of that, Aragon and Saragon, the guy's an absolute baller when it comes to biotech. That's a great that's a great way to do really well if financially and ultimately for shareholders and for patients if you can pull it off.
Yeah, I mean, I
yeah.
think it's a great example. My client, Cardigan, is another good example of that. They're,
Yeah, yeah,
myocardia
yeah,
essentially.
yeah, 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 yeah.
And that's how that came about, right? Like
Right.
the assets were spun back out of BMS.
Fantastic.
And yeah.
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 And a lot of times they're de-risked because they've been, they're later stage assets and it really can become a virtuous cycle. Now you got to get there first, but hopefully some of the things that, we talked about today can help some people that are on the call get there.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's a great point, Jay. One of the trends we've seen the first half of this year is like the Scorpion Therapeutics sale to Lilly, which was a
Yeah. Yeah.
great
Yeah.
outcome,
Yeah.
and then the spin
Yeah.
out right before
Right.
JPM,
Yeah.
and then Dredden Bio out to goodness, I forgot the acquirer, right? But both of
Sanofi.
those, yeah, to Sanofi, thanks.
Yeah.
Both of those were really high profile exits where, the buyers just didn't attach the value the sellers wanted to the non-lead programs, and
Right.
now they're off doing other ones. And there have been some pretty innovative structures on the legal and tax side. Um, legal and tax side to actually make that work for the
Yeah.
sellers.
And guys, you know this, almost never do pharmas acquire you for a platform, right?
Yeah.
I don't know what the percentages know. You probably have it. I would say just roughly 95% of deals, maybe 98% of deals are for an asset or assets. Maybe it's like, hey, this thing works for Parkinson's, but then there's a couple of molecules behind it that may be broader. That can be, technically a platform, but it's really the assets that they're buying you for.
Mhm.
Um, and so a lot of times they'll let you spin that platform back out if they do an acquisition.
Yeah, I also think sometimes people, hear the hype about platform the last, five,
Yeah,
however,
yeah,
10
yeah,
years, right?
yeah.
And they think like that's what I need to message the company as a platform. When in reality, it really is not a platform.
It's not
Uh,
asset discovery. It's an asset discovery tool,
yeah.
right? Yeah,
Yeah. And so and I agree. I was like, I don't think
yeah,
that companies should get so kind of hung up on that's the way they're going to build. I think it really is about the asset, about the data, and don't worry if you're a platform or not.
yeah. And guys, I would much rather do from let's say we're going to do a license deal or collaboration, research collaboration of some kind. I would much rather do an asset oriented deal with a pharma. Where hey, like you guys are great at clinical trials. We got it to the IND or maybe in phase one. You take it, it's off my books. I'm done. Right. Or as opposed to like, hey, all of a sudden now I've got a research collaboration where I got to find 6 targets in 2 years. I mean, that's a pain in the ass. Right. I mean, because it's like, well, what happens if it doesn't work? And I'm working for pharma and like, yeah, the money's great. I've seen companies, take pharma dollars and not actually do the math. Right. And the deal ends up being not worth it. It's actually like they would have been better off not doing the deal. Right. Because again,
Yeah.
like it's not
Yeah.
non-dilutive, right? It's very, very, very dilutive. And one of the things it dilutes, in addition to intellectual property, is it dilutes your time.
Yeah, yeah, no, definitely. And then I think as we kind of mentioned before, you get into a position where if these research programs or research plans are so long too, trying to retain
Yeah.
that talent for that period where you're not being seen as a service provider for
Yeah.
whatever the pharma is and continuing to drive your own internal programs while also kind of being able to do that work within the constraints of the budget, right? Because in a lot of these collaboration and license agreements, you're not, the final say over how it's spent. So you really have to work within that framework, and that can become very challenging.
Yeah. And the other plug, just I'm sure everybody knows on the call knows this, but the other plug is from an M&A perspective. It's often easier for pharmas to do this. And this was a very Gilead-centric way of thinking, but it was easier for us at Gilead to do M&A because it was from a different part of the balance sheet. It was a balance sheet deal versus a P&L deal, right? So if you consider just from the way cash works in a profitable company that has to report to the street, that's an easy argument to make.
I hate to say, look at your magic ball and tell me what you predict, Jay, but I would love to hear your kind of thoughts on it. Like, do you think that there's going to be more of an uptake on M&A versus partnering and collaboration, say, over the next, 18 months?
I would start by saying the pharma business model is structurally incorrect, right? And I don't think they know it yet. I think they know it, but they don't want to admit it because it's going to require big time changes. The stat recently was I saw 65% of drugs on the market are externally discovered, right? So if that's the case, then what the hell are you spending your money on research, right? At Gilead, it was always like, hey, like we know our research isn't, it ended up research more than paid for itself with Hep C, but hey, like we exist to help Gilead find external opportunities, right? And we were very clear about that, right? That's pharma should keep research, alive to some degree to help them be the leaders in those fields, 100%. But so that's the first thing. So structurally, ultimately they're going to become commercialization engines or get broken up. Whatever happens, you guys can probably comment a lot better than I can. What I know is that the patent cliffs are looming large, right? And we've been talking about this now for a decade, right? And they're just now starting to hit. I think by 20, I forget the number. I forget the exact number, but let's just make the number up. Let's say it's $100 billion in revenue. I think it's more goes away by the end of the decade. right? So you need to replace that. And, whether you own it via an M&A or you own it via license, I think pharma is going to always want to take the M&A for a later stage asset because then they have complete control, right? They don't have to worry about the pipsqueak partner going out of business or whatever's going to happen, right? And so certainly going to see later stage assets get acquired more, 100%. Will they do earlier stage deals? I think by proxy, they probably will, just because, that pipeline needs to be filled, right? And they're going to have to backfill, they're going to have to backfill their own attrition. That's one man's opinion. But I do see more of an uptick and talking, and I will say to you, in talking to pharmas for my portfolio companies, I've never seen pharma so ravenous. Now, it hasn't been reflected in transactions as of yet. I mean, I do think you're seeing more deals than you were maybe last year. I haven't seen the clock yet, the numbers versus the clock yet, but it seems like there's been more in 2025 versus there were in 2024. But pharma is absolutely ravenous. Now, can they get out of their own way and do deals? That's the question.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's consistent with what I've been seeing too, for sure.
Right.
Cool. So we'll open it up if anybody has any questions. Feel free to put them in the Q&A. But Jay, while we wait to see if folks have questions, is there anything specific companies can do to take advantage of pharma that needs to fill its development pipeline because we're coming up on the patent cliff?
I mean, I think, as always, form relationships, right? Leverage relationships, form relationships, utilize friends, networks, board members, employees, get in front of them quickly, and then I think, you'll hear this. I mean, it's sort of cliche, but find the internal champion, find the person that can help get the deal over the finish line. Doesn't have to be the CEO of a pharma, doesn't have to be the CSO of a pharma. TA heads are great. TA heads are where I would start always. But just people that have some sort of sway and can get things done. That's the fastest way to get a deal done in pharma. Right.
Yeah.
And then scarcity value. Sorry. No. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, I think that's an absolutely great point that maybe we didn't emphasize more, because I do think that that's what I'm seeing on the deal side for sure, is that there's a lot of times the BD teams are too focused on kind of the terms, and it's really those champions kind of within, and again, to your point, it doesn't have to be the CSO. I don't think a lot of times it is. I think but other champions that are pushing along in the background.
Jay, to that end, are there internal constituencies, be it board members or other folks that that you find to be particularly helpful in, getting in front of the right BD partners, or is it more of a hodgepodge?
The biggest success I've had with that is always the funds. It's always been, because the funds have been doing this, especially the more established funds. The bigger funds tend to be more established, longer. Have partners and people that work for them that are, I say better connected, but have been in the game a long time and have big Rolodexes. That's been the largest source of success for introductions for me over the years.
Yeah, right.
So, and it doesn't have to be necessarily the person on your from that fund in your syndicate. It could be their partner, partner. That's how you do it.
Got it. Couple questions from our attendees here. What would be your advice for mid-sized pharma to bolster themselves to biotechs? So I assume they're asking, if you're a mid-sized pharma company, how can you make yourself more attractive to the biotechs looking for partnering or M&A exits?
You mean big mid-sized to smaller?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think I go first, I guess.
Yeah.
I saw Acadia did a deal recently, right? So like Acadia popped up on everybody's radar screen. Whoa, they're looking for deals. Like, I think letting them know, like, hey, like, hell, like, put out a LinkedIn profile, get an ad in, endpoints, like market yourself, like, hey, we're open for business development deals. Here's the therapeutic areas we're looking for. This is the modality we're looking for. Like, just be very specific about what you're looking for and get it out there. Go to bio, just amplify the voice. Because I'm rather agnostic. I don't need to do a deal with Merck or Pfizer. I'd be happy to do a deal with the midsize or even a small biotech that had, that had commercialized and had money on the balance sheet. I'm reasonably agnostic to that. But I don't know a lot of times, that they're on the list. And so let's say there's 40 acquirers or 50 acquirers on the list. If all of a sudden now that list is 60, great. But I need to know those next 10, and they would do that by some form of PR or amplification, social media amplification.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think, to your point that you made, like using your existing network and also your existing networks, meaning your attorneys, right? Like Josh and I have a lot of, relationships and connections. And so make sure that you're reaching out to counsel as well, who could be making those introductions to companies that maybe you don't know that BD person, but maybe there's someone in our network that we can introduce you to as well.
I completely forgot about you guys. Yeah, I mean, the firms are often, yeah, absolutely. Law firms a lot of times are great sources for introductions. Josh, you've been a very good partner at Pretzel on that front,
I appreciate that.
especially when we were raising a B.
I appreciate that. Speaking of raising a B, another question from the audience. What are some creative bridge financing solutions companies and their investors should consider to help bridge the gap from auction to LOI, LOI to deal docs, and through closing? How can companies and investors find a structure that makes sense for all parties?
That sounds like you, Noel.
Sure, I'll take my own question. Um, Look, obviously if people are putting in equity, that's great. If you have a near-term deal, right, you know that you're going out with a process, you've engaged bankers or have some other structured process. We're seeing a lot of that being done with convertible debt, and then the debt will have increased sort of economics for the investors as the time period is lengthened, meaning that if you take their investment and turn around and do your deal in a pretty short timeline, that the economics are fairly modest. Whereas if their money is at risk for longer, the investors get bigger returns. Lots of times those are in terms of like change of control premiums, right? If we're talking about closing an M&A deal, or better conversion terms if we're talking about bridging to closing equity deals. But convertible debt, it's not the sexiest form of investment vehicle, but it's good. It's good to provide these sort of varying returns when people aren't quite ready to put a price on something. It allows you to take some money in and adjust the sort of economics for the investors as time goes along.
I think another question we had was, do we see big pharma licensing from China continuing to impact M&A and licensing from a US biotech perspective?
Sure. I mean, there's one more, one more competitive set, right? Um, you know, what I want to see is the early stage preclinical deals. When they start supplanting US based preclinical deals, I think that's when I'll stand up and be worried. I mean, I think you're just, there's pent up demand there, and investors are risk off right now, for better or for worse. And there are, looking for later stage assets that, tend to, in my opinion, be in the same sets as, they're all investing in, like 5 different things. And so they're bringing in one of those 5 things in from China that's in phase 2, and they're feeling good about it because all of a sudden it's been de-risked. It's kind of a silly way to think though, because if you look at game theory and you look at commercial launches in any product, but you can look at this in pharma, it tends to be the first 2 guys make all the money, right? And then everybody else makes like fights over 10 or 15%. And that's going to happen in every class of drugs, by the way, including the GLP-1s. So bringing in, an asset just because it's been de-risked, ultimately, I think slows us down a little bit as a field, and maybe not the best use of capital. So I do think it will continue, but I do think we will switch back to being more risk on. And at the end of the day, I think the US is still the best biotech ecosystem in the world, and probably will be for a long time, even with all the changes going on in the government.
Great.
I will say on that note, maybe not with respect to in licensing from China, but with respect to out licensing to other markets. I think one of the newer kind of issues that we've been discussing with clients is really kind of, obviously the state of uncertainty that we're in, but it specifically with respect to what has been publicized about potential most favored nation pricing. And I will say that I think that when clients are considering doing split territory deals, it is uncertain kind of where things are and where they will be in the future, but that should be something to take into consideration if you are out licensing rights to other territories that could impact the pricing and also then affect the pricing that you will have in the US.
Definitely. Well, great. Thanks, everyone. We're coming up to the end of the session here. Jay, I don't know if you had any final thoughts for folks, or we can.
I think it's a fantastic time to start investing in biotech. I mean, again, I really do. Like it's if you're about to start a company and you're worried, go do it now because it will come back. It may not be in 6 months, it may not be in 12 months, but it's going to come back. And if you start it now, you're going to be in a great place. If you're in one now and it's doing well, you're going to be in a great place. So just keep going.
Great. Well, that's it for today, everybody. Jay, thank you very much for joining us. Your insights were really valuable. And thank you to everyone in our audience who joined today. It's been a really great conversation.
Thank you all for having me.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.